about helping those that are in need because of the floods, I couldn't help but think of 2 Corinthians 8. Verse number 4 talks about the Macedonians as good givers. And it listed in those first 8 verses or so, it listed a number of reasons as to why Christians ought to give. And one of the reasons that's given there in that context is a desire of fellowship. Remember verse 4 uses that expression, fellowship. Fellowship, the word koinonia, a coming together, a remaining together in a constant abode. That's the construct of that word. And that's exactly what giving is. You and I can be givers as Christians, and we can share in a common fellowship with brethren all over the world, and certainly in the United States through this particular process. And so you guys are to be commended for that effort and for the announcement that was made just a moment ago. Proverbs, wisdom in marriage. I'm probably not the right person to be up here talking about this. As I mentioned, I'm studying counseling, and I've got 2 kids and a wife. I've been married for almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years next year, and I've learned a few things, but I was talking to somebody out in the foyer, and you've been married for over 60 years. Talked with somebody else 50 years. So, we're just kind of on our honeymoon, really. We're still trying to figure all of this out, and so I don't have a lot to offer. But in this idea of counseling, we've been talking about counseling in the marriage relationship, counseling our children, and as well as counseling people in general. And I've realized, man, I have messed up in over 20 years of preaching. I've messed up along the way, and I've given some bad advice, and I've learned a lot, though. I know I'm going to do a better job. I told Emily, my wife, I said, man, I have messed our kids up. So I'm learning how to be even a better father and husband through this process of learning. Solomon said a long time ago that of the making of, or the writing of many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Well, my flesh is growing pretty weary. I'm tired. I learned that when you hit 40, I'm not there yet, but when you hit 40, at that point, you are officially the dumbest you have ever been in your life. You see, you've heard that everything goes downhill at age 40. That is scientifically true. At least that's what I've learned. So come next year, if you see me, you can know that you are now officially the dumbest you have ever been. Well, hopefully I will just improve. John Keats said this: "Nothing ever becomes real till it is experienced. Even a proverb is no proverb till your life has illustrated it." When you think about the book of Proverbs is really a construct of 2 primary thoughts or ideas, at least the best I can tell. There is the concept of knowledge, and then there's the concept of practicality. So there's taking that knowledge and putting it into practice, into use. Someone once said that Proverbs that experience is the best teacher, but the tuition is high. Proverbs are a literary device to arrest attention, to awaken responsive thought, and to remain fixed in the memory. And so what we're going to do by way of our study is we're going to go to the book of Proverbs. We're going to take one primary text and use it as the springboard for our entire study. And we're going to remember that Proverbs are not just knowledge, but it's a springboard into how we are to live lives pleasing to God, in particular tonight as it relates to the idea of marriage. And when you think about Proverbs and little expressions that are knowledge-based, but we can make application, I ran across an article that I thought I would share with you. This is called Grandpappy's Philosophy on Marriage. You may be familiar with this. I thought it was humorous, but also telling. Trouble in marriage often starts when a man gets so busy earning his salt that he forgets his sugar. Yeah, you've heard this before. Too many couples marry for better or worse, but not for good. When a man marries a woman, they become one. But the trouble starts when they try to decide which one. If a man has enough horse sense to treat his wife like a thoroughbred, may I just make a parenthetical note here? We should not be referring to our spouse as a thoroughbred, I'm just saying. But if a man has enough horse sense to treat his wife like a thoroughbred, she will never be an old nag. Judging from the specimens they pick for husbands, it's no wonder that brides often blush. On anniversaries, the wise husband always forgets the past, but never the present. A foolish husband remarked to his wife, "Honey, you stick to the washing, ironing, cooking, and scrubbing. No wife of mine is going to work." The bonds of matrimony are a good investment only when the interest is kept up. Whether a man winds up with a nest egg or a goose egg depends a lot on the kind of chick he marries. There's another one. Don't call your spouse a chick. Many girls like to marry a military man. He can cook, sew, make beds, is in good health, and he's already used to taking orders. And finally, Grandpappy and his wife were discussing their 40th wedding anniversary when she said, quote, "Shall I kill a chicken for tonight?" "Now," said Grandpappy, "why blame a bird for something that happened 40 years ago?" Well, those are kind of funny, but some would suggest that those were Grandpappy's proverbs. Let's go to the text. Proverbs chapter 5, beginning with verse 15. Now, verses 15 through 19, just so you understand the context here. In my judgment, in reading this passage, we are talking about the sexual relationship that exists between the husband and wife in marriage. That's the context of what we're reading. I believe there's also more to it than just the sexual relationship, and so that's why we will be using this as a springboard. It's my understanding that there is another topic this summer series that will deal with the sexual relationship. Verse 15, "Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love." The language there, of course, is very similar to the language found in another Old Testament book, isn't it? The book of Song of Solomon. Well, in these few verses, we're going to focus primarily on that phrase, "Let thy fountain be blessed," or at least the concept of that. But I'll also point out some other phrases and words here as well. So we think about the subject of marriage. One thought that comes to mind is that marriage is not the great blessing and benefit to some that it ought to be. In fact, marriage to some is much more a burden. It reminds me of what I heard someone said that sometimes in marriage, people, they're looking for the ideal, right? I mean, I'm looking for that perfect spouse. Husbands or husbands-to-be, you're looking for that perfect wife. Wives-to-be, you're looking for that perfect husband, all right? Well, that ideal, once you get married, at some point along the way becomes a raw deal. Or at least that's in some people's minds. So you're looking for the ideal, it becomes the raw deal, and then what happens? You start to look for the new deal, right? Or at least that's what some people do. And so that's why that expression, "Let thy fountain be blessed," is so important. We need to allow our marriages to be blessed. That's God's ideal for marriage. Marriage is designed to be refreshing. It's not designed to be dull and boring. In point of fact, if I can just kind of do a sidebar here. I do this in preaching. I'll do sidebars and parenthetical notes as I approach a text in a lesson. I believe that boredom in marriage is where we often get in trouble. Now, why do you say that? Well, I say it because of this. We have these little smart devices, right? These iOS devices, these Android-based devices, and they're very handy. I mean, I I use one that's got notes on it. We use them for banking. I can control the thermostat at my house from my iPhone. We like our electronic devices. They're cool. They expedite life, but they also get us in trouble. Sometimes you'll have a husband and wife that have been married for a little while, and they become somewhat bored with one another. And so late in the evening, they're lying in bed with one another, and what do they have in their hands? They're not holding one another's hands. They're holding their tablet. They're holding their iPhone, or they're holding their Android. And not only that, what are they doing with it? Surfing the web. Or they're checking social media. Or, as I heard one case today, texting someone of the opposite sex at about 2 o'clock in the morning, an intimate conversation. You see, boredom can get us in trouble. And so marriage is supposed to be blessed and not dull and boring. So let's talk about what we can do to make marriages better, to refresh, to re-energize, to allow our marriages to be the blessed marriage relationships that God wants them to be. Now I want to approach it from this standpoint. First of all, I want us to consider or think about some things that every marriage couple should consider. And then I want us to think about some things that every wife should consider and some things that every husband should consider. So those three primary points or ideas. First of all, I want us to think about the fact that there are some things that every married couple should consider. The first thing I want us to think about is this. There is a real sense of ownership. I didn't say entitlement, but although that might apply, but ownership when it comes to the marriage relationship. When you say, I do, when that husband-to-be, that wife-to-be, they stand in front of that audience and there before the preacher or whomever is conducting the wedding ceremony, and they say, I do, they are saying, I promise to give myself to you so that you can own me. Now, it doesn't mean that we no longer have our own individuality. We do, certainly. We're always going to be our own person, but there is a real sense in which we own one another. If you go back to this text, look at it again. Drink waters out of what? Thine own cistern. Verse 17. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. I own Emily, and Emily owns Neil. And we don't misunderstand that. We totally get that idea. Let's say, for instance, that Emily and I go into the mall. I'm not a big fan of the mall. I don't go there very often. And I'll tell you the difference typically between a man and a woman. A woman goes into the mall and she does what? She shops. She goes store to store. And she's looking at all of the different shops and stores, and she's picking this off the rack and putting it back, and then going over here and picking this off the rack and putting it back. And that just goes on and on for hours. But a man, if he goes to the mall, what's he doing? I need a shirt and I need a tie. I'm going to Belk, Macy's. I'm going to the store. I'm getting my shirt. I'm getting my tie. I'm checking out, and I'm going home. Now, my wife doesn't like to go shopping with me because I like to try to see how cheap I can get something. And so I actually will dicker with the person at Macy's and see if I can get that dress shirt a little cheaper. You never know unless you ask, guys. But that's the difference between the man and the woman, the husband and the wife. Well, let's say Emily and I are at the mall, and she's doing her shopping thing, and I'm just out in the mall, part of the mall, sitting down, and I'm watching people as they walk by, and it's really interesting to watch people at the mall, by the way. A lot of characters at the mall. And I'm there in the mall, part of the mall, and this woman walks out of the store, and the woman that walks out of the store, she is petite, she has brown eyes, she has brown hair, and she's wearing a Simply Southern t-shirt. I don't know what does that mean? I don't know what the deal is with Simply Southern t-shirts, but I just ordered my wife a couple of them because she really likes them. All right, so she's coming out of the mall. I don't know if this is me or not. I'm going to switch this around just in case. So this individual comes out of the shop. She's doing all her calls. She looks in a lot of ways just like Emily. What am I going to do with that woman? Am I going to grab her by the hand and walk out of the mall with her, get in the car and go home? No. Why? Because she's not mine. She doesn't belong to me. I don't belong to her. I only belong to Emily, and Emily only belongs to me. And so when we think about marriage and how that married couples need to think about marriage, they need to understand that there is a sense in which they own one another. Look at Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. In this marriage text, comparing the church, the husband, Jesus, and his bride, the church, with the husband and the wife. Verse number 25 says, husbands, love who? Your wives. Not somebody else's wife. Love your wife. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Why should I love her? Because I own her. The Bible says here, husbands, love your wives just as what? Just as your own body. Take care of her just as you would your own body. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning with the first verse. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication. Another translation there, probably a better rendering would be, but because of fornication. Let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto his wife, the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. And so I own her. She owns me. There is a sense in which that is entirely biblically accurate. But there's a second thought here, and that is that God's laws regarding marriage need to be applied. And when we apply God's laws of marriage, marriage is going to be better. You know, it usually is, isn't it? If we do things God's way, life is usually better. I say usually, life is just better. It reminds me of the peace section of Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible. You know, that chapter is divided into sections with a heading, at least in the English Bible. Each heading is a letter from the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and so on. And when you get to the peace section of Psalm 119, it talks about that very idea, about following the will of God. We ought to do what God says to do, the way God says to do it, for the purpose God says to do it, without question, no matter the cost. Okay? And so the same goes with respect to our marriage. If we will do marriage God's way, it will help us to avoid selfishness. It's not about me. It's not about what I want. Let me illustrate it this way. So my wife drives a minivan. I'm not particularly fond of minivans. I get it. I call it the FUV. Are you with me? The family utility vehicle. I just struggle saying that I own a minivan. Okay, I own an FUV. I also own a truck, so that makes it, that kind of balances it out. But let's say, for instance, that Emily comes to me and says, you know, the minivan is old and it's about shot, and it is, and it's time for us to get rid of that. And I say, Emily, you know, I understand it's time for us to replace that. I don't really want another FUV. Can we do something different? But I really like my minivan. I really like it. And I really want another one. And that's just what I have my heart set on. And so what am I going to do? Am I going to selfishly say, no, you're not going to do that. We're going to go buy you a tank. And she needs a tank, by the way. And she would tell you that she needs a tank minivan. But what we're going to do here to compromise, we're going to get a minivan that has a Hemi in it. Are you with me? All right, so that's the compromise. So I am not being selfish and saying, okay, we're not getting the minivan. She's not being selfish and saying, okay, we're going to get a little 6-cylinder, 2.4-liter minivan. We're going to get the Hemi engine. All right? Now, it's just an illustration. I'm hoping we don't have to go back to the FUV. I don't have a problem with them. I just don't personally care for them, although they have done our family worlds of good over the last several years. It will also help us to avoid retaliation. We're not going to go after our spouse. If we love our spouse, if I love Emily, and if Emily really loves me, she's not going to retaliate against me. And if I do something wrong, guess what? She's not going to get historical on me. In other words, if I do something wrong and I realize it, she lovingly brings it to my attention, and I say, honey, I'm sorry, you're right, I was wrong on that. And I need to do better, and I need to change that attitude or that behavior or whatever it may be, then here 2-3 years down the road, or sometimes with us guys, 2-3 weeks down the road, and I do the same thing again, then my wife is not going to say, get historical, not hysterical, get historical on me and bring up the past all the time. You see, it's going to keep that from happening because I'm interested in loving my spouse. It's going to help me to be kind to her, to him. I'm not going to lie to my spouse. And I'm going to love my spouse with agapao, with sacrificial love, agape. That's what 1 Corinthians 13 is about, isn't it? That's the love chapter of the Bible. We'll meet over there in a moment to talk more about it. But if I do marriage God's way, it's going to help me love my spouse. Let me give you some suggestions. And I believe that as you think about the book of Proverbs is not just a book of wisdom, but it's a book of practical wisdom for everyday living, okay? So I want to give you some practical suggestions to avoid matrimonial suicide. Now, these are not all original with me. These are things that I've just collected over time. But here's one. Don't make a habit of being apart. Don't make a habit of being apart. Now, I realize that there are some extreme situations in which a husband and wife have to be apart. And it's not because they're mad at one another and they've gone through a separation. That's not what I'm talking about. But there are occasions where maybe a husband or wife has to go to war. All right? Maybe there's a situation in which a husband or wife has a job and that job takes them away from home. When I was growing up, my dad, he was at home. He was there every night, except for the very rare business trip. But once I got out of the house, once I was in college, actually my brother and sister as well, they're younger than I am, but once we were all out of the house, my dad took a different job that required travel all over the world. And he did that knowing that his wife, my mom, could go with him. And so they could travel and do these things together. But don't make a habit of being apart. In my judgment, if we're not careful, then when we separate like this for long periods of time, then we can be guilty of at least the principle of Matthew chapter 5. And listen to what Jesus says here in verse number 32. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication. Now notice this expression. Causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Now, there's a principle here, okay? The principle is, if I separate from Emily for an extended period of time, for various reasons, but if I separate from her, we're not around one another, we don't enjoy intimacy, we don't enjoy just general conversations, communication, and so forth, I am making it far more easy for her to commit adultery because I'm not around, okay? That's the principle there. Sometimes when I'm doing counseling with married couples, and when I'm a licensed professional counselor, I hope I'll do a better job even, but I still know the Bible here, so you can't get much better than that. But when I'm counseling married couples and they say, we just don't like one another, we just want to separate, and I say, okay, here's the deal. You can separate, but here's what I mean. You need to come together and say, look, we want to follow Jesus first and foremost. That's our ultimate goal in life, is to follow Jesus and go to heaven and help one another go to heaven. Now, right now, we're having a difficult time. So what we need to do is we need to separate, but that separation needs to be mutually agreed upon, and it needs to be for a time, implication a short period of time, for the specific purpose of spiritual development. Is that not what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7? Indeed. Where he said that separation needs to be for a time for the purpose of fasting and prayer. All right? So there are times in which we may separate, but don't make a habit of it. Number 2, matrimonial suicide. Don't be bitter toward one another. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. All right? Number 3, love one another like Christ loved the church. That's a biggie. Love one another like Christ loved it. How much did Jesus love the church? A whole bunch. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ did what? Died for us. Husbands, do you love your wife enough to die for her? I think the converse would also be true. Wives, do you love your husbands enough that you would be willing to die for him? How do you know? How do you know that you would be willing to die for your spouse? Are you living for your spouse? You see, you have to sacrificially live for her, for him, before you would ever be willing to die for your spouse. Number 4, rejoice with the wife of thy youth. That's what the Proverbs writer says here in verse number, verse number 18. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Well, how do you do that? Are you playful with one another? I remember not too long ago that Emily and I were arguing over something. Isn't it funny how that you can argue over something and you have no idea what you were arguing about? We were arguing about something, and I don't remember what it was about, and all of a sudden I just stopped and I said, we sure do have fun, don't we? You know, and it is. Sometimes we get into it, and then we just have this mental realization that what we're arguing about is just silly. It's ridiculous, and we don't need to be arguing about it in the first place. And then we just start to laugh, and we say, my, what fun that we have. But be playful with one another. Be playful in situations like that, but play as well. Do something with your spouse. If you're, guys, if your wife really likes to go to the mall, go to the mall. Maybe you can get a peanut butter parfait out of the deal from Dairy Queen, but go to the mall. Ladies, if your husband really likes to play golf, then go to the golf course. It's 4 hours. If he goes, now listen to me. If he goes and spends 4 hours at that mall, you need to go spend 4 hours on that golf course with him, all right? And you get to ride in a golf cart, and I bet you he'll let you drive it. And it can be a lot of fun. But be playful with one another. Number 2, don't be critical of one another in front of somebody else. You want to commit matrimonial suicide? That'll do it. Do not criticize your spouse in front of someone. Here's another thought. Write sentimental notes. One of the ways that I get bonus points, if you want to call them that, but one of the ways that you can get bonus points is take a dry erase marker, and before you leave for work, write your wife a note on the mirror. Now, what happens in my house is, generally speaking, I'm up way before everybody else. And sometimes I have to leave before, and I don't want to wake anybody else up, but sometimes I have to leave early in the morning before Emily ever gets up. And there are occasions in which I will write a note to Emily on the mirror in our bathroom. Now, you be very careful, guys, what you write on that mirror, especially if you have kids at home. But write sentimental notes. Do that sort of thing. And it'll go a long way. Celebrate your anniversary. And have markers where you make a big deal out of the anniversary. Do something that is special for your spouse for the anniversary. Save for it. Plan for it. Years in advance, if need be. But celebrate that. That's part of what the writer is saying here when he says, rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Use code language or use flattering terminology that is only for your spouse. I do not like it when I'm going to the Cracker Barrel and the waitress comes up to me and starts using words like honey and sweetie and all that kind of stuff. I'm nobody's honey or sweetie except for Emily's, all right? And I'm not going to call another woman honey or sweetie or babe or whatever, okay? I'm not going to call another woman that because I only have one, and that's Emily. And so use that language only with your spouse. Read together is another one. Resolve your conflicts together. And be careful when you do it. If you have kids at home, close the door. Don't fuss in front of the kids. And don't fuss to your parents about your spouse. Control the sarcasm and the mockery. Control the drama. Avoid past and even some future predictions. You always fill in the blank. You're always going to fill in the blank. Don't do it. Don't do those things. All right. That's what every marriage couple needs to keep in mind. All right. Let me give you some things that every wife should consider, and I'll go through these fairly quickly. Every wife needs to consider her position. You say, well, you must be talking about Ephesians 5, that she is to submit to her husband. That's true. The Bible teaches that very plainly, that she submits under his authority, just as Jesus submitted under the authority of the Father, just as the man submits under the authority of Jesus. There's nothing wrong with submission. It's not making one a lower class citizen because you're submitting, despite what the people in the world would want us to believe, the liberal media and so forth. It's just a realization that I have a different role, okay? But that's not the position that I want to talk about. The position I want to talk about is what is found in Genesis chapter 2. And that position is a helpmeet. Ladies, that is your primary responsibility in marriage, is to be that's why you were created, to be his helpmeet, his help suitable. You know what that Hebrew word means, though? In essence, help him go to heaven. That's it. Now, certainly it's true that he's supposed to help you go to heaven, and that's part of what Ephesians 5:22 and following is talking about. He loves you as he loves himself. He takes care of you as he takes care of himself. And surely if he loves himself properly, he's going to try to get himself to heaven. And therefore, if he loves you properly, he's going to try to help you go to heaven. But you were specifically given the role as a helpmeet, a help suitable, to guide him from this life all the way to the next successfully. That's your primary objective. All right, let me mention this one. Let me shift it and go to the husbands. I've got a lot more I could talk about, but every husband needs to consider some things as well. One is you need to consider the responsibility to cleave to your spouse. When you made the decision to get married and you joined yourself to her, you were saying that she is going to be the most important person in your world. More important than your mom, and by the way, more important than your children. When I'm doing counseling with couples that are struggling through the situation where maybe it's a husband and wife and they have kids, and the husband is saying that the wife just doesn't spend any time with me, that she's very devoted to the kids, which, nothing wrong with caring for the kids, but she's very devoted to the kids, and she's so devoted to them that she doesn't have any time for me. then what we talk about is this, that one of these days, those kids are going to be where? They're going to be gone. But you know what? You are still going to be together living under that big roof in that house with all those rooms. If your devotion is totally to your kids right now and not to one another, in other words, if you're not the most important person to one another, but your kids are, and those kids are gone, how are you going to have a relationship at that point? It's going to be extremely difficult. And so remember who's most important to you. Cleave to her. And then view her as good. View her as good. View her as someone who is worthy of your absolute praise and devotion. Proverbs 18 and verse 22. Be benevolent toward her. Love her, Ephesians 5. Be sweet to her, Colossians 3. And certainly honor her, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. All of these matters. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad in rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Marriage is to be a blessing and not a curse. And if we're going to have marriages, if we will have marriages God's way, they will be a blessing. Doesn't mean that everything's going to be perfect. Doesn't mean that there will never be a disagreement. It doesn't mean that there will never be moments in which you have to just kind of walk away and think and probably pray a little bit. But your marriage is still going to be blessed. I heard a story recently about a West Texas cowboy. The West Texas cowboy decided that it was time to get some insurance, some life insurance. So he invites the insurance agent to his ranch, and when the insurance agent comes over, they pull out the application and they begin to go through it. And the agent said to the rancher, he said, have you ever had any accidents? He said, accidents? No, I can't think of any accidents that I've had. My horse kicked me in the chest and broke a couple of ribs. A rattlesnake, I got bit by a rattlesnake twice, but I've never had any. You don't call those accidents? And the cowboy said, no, they did that on purpose. In order for our marriages to be successful, we're going to have to work on purpose. A successful marriage does not come by accident. It comes by effort. Strong effort. The same is true with respect to our Christian lives. You and I do not accidentally obey God. We don't accidentally follow Jesus. Now, providentially, people may come into our lives who tell us about Jesus, but we don't accidentally choose to obey God. And if you're here tonight and you need to become a Christian, you're not going to do it by accident. But you with purpose are going to come to Him in faith, repenting of your sins, changing your mind about it, confessing, I believe Jesus Christ to be the Son of God, allowing yourself to be immersed in water for the remission of your sins. You'll do all of that on purpose. And if you're here tonight as a Christian, but one who has left their first love, maybe even as it exemplifies itself in your relationships, maybe even in your marriage, you're not going to fix that by accident. It's going to take work. You're going to have to do it on purpose. If we can help you in that, we'd be happy to pray for you. If tonight's invitation is yours, we're going to stand and sing, I assume, a song of encouragement. If tonight's invitation is yours, make it so, as together we stand and as we sing.